and welcome to our weekly Brattleboro Legislative Roundtable. We were doing these every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and this week we are focusing on racial justice in our community and in the legislature specifically. We have invited, I'm here, Representative Emilie Kornheiser, and I'm here with Representative Tristan Toleno and Representative Mollie Burke. And we are focusing on racial justice today, and we have invited some folks in the community with expertise on this issue to join us so we can hear what they're thinking and what they're looking for, as well as having a broader conversation. We are trying to focus really specifically today, if possible, on what can be done in the legislature, knowing that there's much to be done in our community, there's much to be done in our town, there's much to be done in our country. But in order to make the conversation as really focused and deep as we can, we're gonna try to focus on that one area. And so to start us off, I would just like to express some gratitude and grief for the moment that we're in and for the urgency of it, and for what the pain and the labor that has taken us to get to this moment in our community, and also the gratitude for what all of the people who are standing up right now and saying too much, it has to stop, and have been doing that for so long, because that urgency creates a moment for us as legislators to bring our colleagues along more courageously than we might have been able to otherwise. And so I think the three of us are very aware, and many other of our colleagues are aware of what a profound moment this is to make change and courageous change possible that might not have been possible a year ago. And so really want to name that. We also know that it's really, really important that we bring all of your voices with us up to Montpelier, and that we include deep stakeholder engagement when we're passing laws about things that affect specific communities. And we know that most of, enormous amounts of stakeholder engagement have happened, and there have been endless studies and task forces and work groups. And so we know what we need to do. And we know that a lot of your voices have spent a lot of years getting into this conversation already. And so don't want to start back from the beginning. We also know that we have personal work to do, and we're happy to talk about that if that's of interest to people. And, but really, we're ready to make action this year, and we have some ideas on how to make that happen. So, Tristan or Mollie, do you want to say anything, or should we, I know Stefan can just join us for a few minutes, so I would love to give him the floor.
Yeah, I think that would be the best.
Okay, great. Stefan, it's your turn.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. My name is Stefan. I think that I know most of everybody on this call. I don't know everyone, so good morning. I'm with the County NAACP, and I can't stay long, but I'm glad to be invited here. So there are just a couple things that I think that the Windham County NAACP would love to see more intentional discussion around when it comes to racial justice and police forum, particularly police forum today. I have 4 things that we would love to see more action on policy-wise from the legislative body and the State House. The first thing would be the implementation of a community oversight boards or committees for every town that contracts with the sheriff's office. Now, I don't know necessarily exactly how that might intersect with work that you do, but I do know that you have power to help within that. I will say that in Putney, Vermont, if you're looking for an example of what it could look like, Putney, Vermont just implemented, well, not necessarily implemented, but they just gave their equity committee that's part of their select board their more power to review and make recommendations about police conduct and police policy to their select board. I think this is something that is extremely beneficial. This is something that the NAACP aided with. And I believe that if we can do this for other communities that also contract with the Sheriff's Department in conglomeration with what we already have going on the statewide level, that we really could form a lot better and a lot more effective structural change with community involvement. This is also something that is happening around the country. The reason why we're arguing for it now, it's not lost on us, but if we look at Minneapolis as an example, they had quite a bit of built up relationship with their police chief there. He's a Black man. I know the president of the NAACP for that city well. She's a friend of mine, and they had an established relationship. However, their police did what they wanted to do, and obviously, even with that relationship being what it was, they still ended up in the situation that they are in. And so I think that for us, it's become obvious that Minneapolis did not have enough community engagement. The community did not feel empowered enough, and so now we have mass protests and uprisings happening. I think we have a chance to get ahead of that structurally. Of course, I don't know exactly how to get there. I will leave that up to y'all, but it has been spoken now, so so it's in the air. The next thing is that I want our legislative body to participate in some intentional conversation around what the intersection of economics and policing looks like in this country. Right now, we have a lot of discussion going on about defunding the police. Who even knows what that means right now? There are a lot of definitions going on about what defunding the police mean. To me, and I think from the Wyndham NAACP perspective, I think that it's just an opportunity to have an intentional conversation in a way that we haven't been able to have one before about the economics of policing, what police need to do their job effectively and what they don't need to do their job effectively, and what the state body can do to help them succeed in that mission, honestly. And so just seeing more engagement around that. I have not heard a lot from anyone in the State House around that topic publicly. I don't know what's being said, behind the scenes, of course. But that's something that I would love to see more discussion on, and I would love to be part of the discussion on as well. The third thing is, I know that there are a couple use of force bills that are on the floor or are getting ready to come to the floor off the wall at some point in time. I would love to see more action from the Wyndham County on that because I think that's important. And especially when it comes to, knees, hands, feet, toes. No, but honestly, illegal chokeholds, things like that, those things need to be addressed. And then lastly, I would love to see movement around use of body cameras and complaint structures. I know that a lot of community policing departments like Brattleboro PD, for example, has their own ways in which complaints are handled internally. However, those processes definitely have flaws. At being part of the NAACP, we have utilized those processes before to represent folks that have had issues, and we've run into challenges along the way. And so I would love to see a little bit more top-down work when it comes to that from the State House. Other than that, I don't necessarily have anything else. I will say, though, lastly, before I jump off, that when we talk about the complaint system, I think that we need to be also thinking intentionally about how the community can be involved with that. And so when we have a review board, first of all, it cannot be an advisory board. Review boards have more power. And so we love to throw advisory boards on things. I would like to see a review board. And with this review board, I would love to see the chance and the opportunity for folks to have recommendation power. And that's really it for me. I don't know if you have any clarifying questions, I can do my best to answer those. But if that is all, then that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm happy to. So thank you, Stefan. And I'm gonna just throw a few things into the mix here. And I know we're gonna lose you in a minute. One thing that I would say that's sort of thematically connected to some of those recommendations is that that particularly like the advisory boards and use of force and other things goes right to the heart of what the power that we as a civil society have given to police in terms of the decision making and the impact of that decision making, and what sort of the subtext of that. There's two subtexts that I think are important to name. One is we're not having a conversation systemically at each level about what it means to have given those powers to individuals and what it means to be accountable to us for the power that we've given them. But then there's an additional layer, and I think that this is a crucial part of what is shifting is shifting for us in the political environment, which is that this is also about the way that power protects, a system of white privilege, and that we have to get better at surfacing power and surfacing the ways in which that is protected. And I'm going to step back and make sure that some of the other voices that we've invited to participate get in, but I just wanted to surface the power dynamics and the way that specifically protects white privilege and white power, and the need for us to have that conversation.
Curtis, do you want to go next because you have time limits?
Yes, thank you. One, I'd like to echo and reinforce Stefan's message around citizen review as opposed to citizen advisory. That is critical, that citizens have access to all the records, internal communications, and have the power to overturn decision that a department might make that might be counter to what citizens want. So that's one thing. The other, again, I'm looking at this from like a 30,000 foot level, that the real challenge we have is one of the balkanization of Vermont. Every town, every jurisdiction operates off its own code of conduct. And the degree to which the legislature can force the hand of all towns to have common set of policies and practices and training and supervision, I think is where the real battle will take place. But given our size, given the number of law enforcement officers we have, given that should not be as difficult as it will be. One of the challenges around citizen review boards is they're left in the hands of select boards to choose who should be on those review boards. And there's no guarantee that the citizens that are chosen for the review boards have a progressive view of law enforcement. So that's sort of one thing I want to sort of resonate and reinforce with what Stefan has said. The other is my personal pet peeve, and that pet peeve has to do with the training council that currently and has forever set independent of any government oversight. That needs to change. It needs to be under the executive branch, whether it falls under the Department of Public Safety or agency administration, but we've got to move the training council so that someone in state government can direct them in terms of curriculum, in terms of the types of courses that are offered, looking at decertification, and making sure that decertification of officers is done, making sure that data collection is taking place. I mean, so that we simply cannot we can no longer have a police academy or a police training council that is independent of any government oversight.
Thank you.
All right.
Go on. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Right. The other thing, we if you've seen the sort of 10-point modernization plan that came from state police, came from Mike Sherling and public safety, we had a hand in helping to write that. Actually, a couple of us from Windham County. So anyway, that's all I have to say. If you can manage to move the training council into the executive branch, that'd be great.
Thank you. I think we're gonna make some space for Mimi next, but before we do that, I just wanna do sort of a quick response so that you don't, neither of you leave and feel like we just listened and didn't actually commit to doing anything. So the pieces of legislation that are sort of the clearest as part of a package that we're talking about that I want to name, in addition to like the work that we've really deepened as a caucus, a Democratic caucus, to be doing like on ourselves with our whiteness, is some conversations about the school system, both the weighting study and expulsions and suspensions. Mm-hmm. A real focus on HR practices, as you both named, including hiring, training, and promotion, really in line with what you're talking about. Accountability, which might include racial impact statements and legislation, clear data collection across state government so that we can understand the scale of the problems and solutions, body cams, an end to any use of surplus military gear, even though that is less of a problem in Vermont than I think many other states. And yes, of course, expanded legislation on use of force. And so that the use of force is both H808 and S119, and the hiring and training is H464. And then the last thing that I think is really important to talk about, and so those are probably all going to be smushed together into a bill. What's one of the things that's really beautifully available in this moment is that so much of what we're talking about is already on the wall, and because people have been doing this work for so long, and so we can take it off the wall and actually do something about it instead of having to start from scratch. Curtis, do you mind if I have one more sentence?
Sure.
Thank you. And then last, when we talk about defunding the police, as you said, Stefan, I think what we're talking about is really investing in so much else that we might not prioritize. And so that's health disparities, expanded social work, and doing the work within the social work system to address white supremacy and how it plays out there. Making sure that our restorative justice programs are both expanded and funded, and that they're equitable. And we just passed the Justice Reinvestment bill, which goes a huge, long way towards that. And then true community leadership, like what you were both talking about with, rather than having advisory councils, have accountability councils, right? Like that's a big difference. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of those are the things that are in the mix right now. Curtis.
Right, I just want to reinforce the around data, that I think legislation needs to indicate that the data has to be consumer friendly. If you go to the Crime Research Group, they've got great data, but it's really dense and it's not accessible to the common man or woman. And so I would make sure that there's some indication that the data, is consumer friendly, so that we can all look at it and see it, and not have to hire statisticians to interpret what the data is saying.
I agree. It's probably one of my greatest passions in state government, in a way that I think my colleagues find me slightly peculiar about. So thank you, Curtis. Stefan.
Will there be a statement released at all from any of you all about what you actually would define as defunding the police? I appreciate what you've said, and I think that we're on the same page, but I would love for there to be an actual statement around what this conversation looks like in Vermont, so that we can actually have holistic stakeholder involvement in that. Because I've heard other discussion around defunding of the police, and this is it's a big buzzword right now, a big buzz sentence, I guess I would say. And it sounds somewhat similar, but also different depending on where you stand politically, and where you stand fiscally, especially. And so I think that if we could, if there was a statement maybe from our county ledge that we could be talking around, maybe even as a county, and leveraging around, that would be beneficial. And so that we could be comparing it to what others are saying in other counties that are more conservative than ours.
Thank you. A number of members of the Progressive Caucus released a public statement from the Burlington area.
Was that the one that Brian Chena was on?
Yeah.
Brian Chena and Rep Gonzalez.
And Colburn. And then I gave remarks at the rally yesterday that I'm happy to turn into a public statement as an op-ed. I think bringing the whole county into a conversation, you might wind up with something a little more moderate than you might get from the three of us. And so we can sort of look at those levels. And then if you're looking at the entire Democratic caucus, we are going to issue a public statement, and that will again be more moderate than, say, the county. And I think you understand sort of the nested nature of the political spectrum going from Brattleboro on out.
Yep.
We Windham County legislators meet every other week on a Tuesday, and we'll be meeting this Tuesday, so we can discuss that.
Thank you for the request for accountability.
Thank you.
Mimi, the floor is yours.
Sorry, I have to unmute. Hi, so I'm Mimi Brill. I'm the supervising attorney at the Public Defender's Office in Windham County. And all of these are great ideas, and it's exciting to see. So thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Curtis. I don't even know. Oh, you're still there? Yes, good. So I guess I've just been, and I don't necessarily speak in an official capacity from the Defender General. Please, I don't. This is just my own personal observations and thoughts from my work over the years. I know there was some talk about, increasing hate crime legislation in response to this, and I find that that's not a good plan. We don't need as more crimes for police to get involved in and have police violence about it. I don't think that's really responsive to the moment. I think what we need is some more crimes, perhaps where it's defined that police officers are the perpetrators. In other words, if there's a destruction of evidence, where, and obviously, some of the more horrible crimes. But so I just want to speak to some of the specifics. So if we're talking about body cameras, which I do think is a great idea, we have to say that if somebody turns off their body camera, that's problematic. And it's so problematic that the case will be dismissed and the officer will be dismissed and will be put on unpaid leave until that is investigated. Because it's real, that's what we see very often in watching hours and hours of these videos. I see officers will communicate with each other and turn off their body camera. And so they shouldn't have that ability. at all. That would be probably the best. Or if they do, there's going to be they're going to have to come to account. I love the idea of the community oversight. I would say, you know, rather than having internal review boards, which are these secret review boards, they should be external review boards. They should be public. There should be public access to them. We should have records. We recently had a Brattleboro officer who went to another community and wreaked havoc there after having serious problems here. And the public needs to have access to that. So I love the idea of an external review board where it's all police personnel files are made public. I think that makes sense. I also think that if there's been a police-involved shooting or death, or perhaps just excessive use of force, that needs to go to a grand jury rather than be reviewed by prosecutors, whether it be local Windham County prosecutors. I think that's a very uncomfortable position for them to be in any event, but also even, you know, the Attorney General should not be in a position of doing those internal secret reviews. Then they just put out a study. I know in 2014, you may know of the case of Michael Santiago, who was shot, killed by a local officer. That never went to a grand jury. I think, I think everybody knows the difference, but that it is, so a grand jury is, you know, citizens would decide rather than, you know, one or two prosecutors and whoever investigates. So I think that's really important. I think that the notion of somebody who does shoot somebody or, you know, cause, you know, excessive force, I think the notion of being on paid leave, it should be unpaid leave. And I think that any liability that is founded should come out of the police retirement fund as opposed to the citizens' taxes. I think that's just something to be thinking about, how to fund the liability as well. I think in terms of, I'm kind of all over the place. I'm sorry, I didn't really prepare something, but
I really appreciate your specificity. It's great.
Sure. I think no-knock warrants, that's another. So I'm also, I keep hearkening back to, I hope it's, I mean, I think it's okay. He passed away. So Michael Santiago, who was killed at the hands of police in our community, that's the latest one that I know of. And it's really important that we not say this, this happens, you know, out in the South or out West. It happens here in Brattleboro police. It happened with, and that was as a result of a no-knock warrant, similar to Breonna Taylor. There needs to be an end to no-knock warrants, and that's something you can specifically legislate. So there's no need. You know, what they're looking for typically is an amount of drugs. If the drugs get flushed, then they're gone. Like, okay, so, you know, I understand that perhaps we won't be over incarcerating somebody for 30 years, which is what they're facing. But it's an important, I think in terms of no-knock warrants, that's where you have really serious outcomes, bad outcomes. I do think, you know, in terms of the militarization of the local police, you know, I've done trials where the officers come in like army flak jackets. I mean, I don't know what to call them. They're these black, very militant looking garb. And I think there ought to be an end to that. I don't think we need police walking around looking like that. I think I know maybe we don't have tanks in Brattleboro like they do for the Pumpkin Festival, but you know, which is obviously an outrage. But I do think we do have military type gear and garb, and it's and I don't think it helps with citizens feeling comfortable with the police. I'm really excited that you're like just taking this time. You know, I know it's very much the moment, and it's just horrible what's happening in terms of police violence. I think it's really exciting to see the citizenry uprising. I think it's fabulous, and I do hope that we have great outcomes as a result of it. But I feel like, you know, we've been saying this for a long time, and now we finally are getting video everywhere. So there's this great evidence and support. But I do think it's time to relook at the police. And I think also the notion, and I'm sorry that I didn't see your 10-point plan, which sounds really interesting. I'd love it if you could share. I don't know if you could share it with the group, or if that's a possibility, or send it to me. I would love to see it. But you know, it definitely sounds like you're doing great work, and that's wonderful. So I don't know if anybody has questions for me.
Thank you. So the 10-point plan was from Michael Sherling and the administration. So I would not say that that's something that, I wouldn't say it's ours. I would say it's the administration's plan. And I think it's wonderful how much this moment is supporting them to come to the table in a much more meaningful way than they might have a year ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago. And I think it, you know, we're going to need to go further than what's in that plan. Really appreciate the detail here. Really, I have a question for everyone about that I think has been highlighted in a few different ways. So we've talked about citizen review boards, and we've talked about juries. And when we talk about defunding the police, we often talk about restorative justice, which involves a lot of community participation. And in small, you know, I was going to say in small towns, but in our town too, the ability of community members to step into this fully and be unbiased themselves, or aware of their own bias, or what would it take to make sure that our, you know, as we turn this over to our communities, to make sure that the community, that we have the leadership that we need to make it work. And so that's sort of a question that I'm really wrestling with, is how, you know, even for this, this conversation we're having here, I was very aware that the folks that I was inviting to join the conversation were folks that were like incredibly overworked and underpaid and stretched thin already. And so we'll be thinking, as we work on this legislation, what it's going to take to really bring our communities up to the capacity that they need to hold the level of accountability that I think we're all looking for, and the leadership that we're looking for.
May I add just a brief layer to that?
Yeah.
You know, I've Curtis, since you mentioned the decertification of officers, a part of I've been, you know, listening, but also part of my brain has been thinking back to a time in committee that when I was on the Government Operations Committee a few years ago, when we tried to have a conversation about decertification, and also to your point about, you know, who gets put, if we find a way to create a more robust review board system, who's on that is really important. And the reason, the connection between these 2 points for me is that that in the dynamics of our committee room around decertification, there were people who were there who felt that it was their mission to protect officers from any conversation around decertification, and that will happen at every level at which citizens engage. So I think we have to think sort of at, you know, we have to figure out how to embed certain values in the structure of what we create, so that it's harder for those systems, if we empower them, to be hijacked by forces that want to protect against accountability. And that's another facet of this work, is to both create the structures and then also to make sure that those structures are in service to change and not to the status quo or to the protection of some part of the system.
Yeah, and you know, decertification, well, what I advocated for was if an officer has been fired anywhere in the state, that they automatically are decertified and cannot work in any other jurisdiction in the state of Vermont. The other more challenging issue in terms of the civilian review boards is, do we set a common set of standards for review that cut across all jurisdictions? Or do we allow each individual jurisdiction to determine what the threshold for misconduct might be, or what the threshold would be for overturning a decision by a chief, or for the firing or other disciplinary action against an officer? So if you mandate that these civilian review boards be created, I think you also need to be prepared with the operational cornerstones for those boards, so that you don't have a different set of values and a different set of operating principles as you move from Brattleboro to Putney, or from Windham County to Windsor County. And so I think you really need to be prepared to really go deep into the weeds of articulating these review boards.
Thank you. I think, local control is really wonderful and beautiful and powerful, and also incredibly difficult sometimes, as you know and highlighted. And I think we use model policies sometimes as a way of fixing that. And we need to be clear that a model policy is a floor and not a ceiling or a suggestion. And I also really, Mimi, thank you for saying the no-knock warrants, because I've heard a lot of that in the national conversation, and it is not something that has joined the Vermont conversation yet. And so it will absolutely be added to the list. Thank you.
And that did come up in the Social Equity Caucus meeting this week, and I do think that there will be the Social Equity Caucus is both an inside the building caucus and an outside the building caucus. So there are members of the public who participate in the conversations, and it's members of the House and Senate who have come together around social equity issues. And there's a fairly large number of people in it, and I think it's going to rise as a priority from within the Social Equity Caucus, which will help institutionally move it to the forefront of conversations in policy making.
Great. I wondered if anyone else who's here as a representative of an organization working on this. So I don't know, Ethan, I think you're here for Lost River, and Mary, I don't know if you're here for the Community Equity Collaborative, but wondering if either of you have anything you want to add. Or if there's someone else who's here as a representative of something that I don't know about and is on a different screen or something, please make yourself known as well.
I really appreciate you all having this conversation. Yeah, and I'm here as a part of Lost River Racial Justice. There are a number of other folks here as well. I see Gail and Claire. I'm not sure who else. I don't have everyone on one screen. I appreciate, Tristan, what you're saying about the idea that police power has been set up to defend a system of white power and white privilege. And I appreciate, Emily, what you're saying about, as we get more citizen involvement, as we get more accountability to people in the community, shifting resources away from police maybe. How do we ensure that the people who are taking those roles are not also upholding that system of white supremacy? And how do we create the norm in all of our citizen roles, all of our involvement in in our state and governance, that everyone has the intention of actively challenging white supremacy? And I don't have a good answer for that. That's really deep work and long-term work. But I worry about, if we recognize that the system of policing, the system of giving people that sort of power has been designed to defend white supremacy, and we're just sort of tweaking around the edges of that. How do we really get to a place of deeper change in the long run? And I think that requires a commitment to really deep learning and unlearning, especially by white folks, and a process of really deep accountability. And by that, I mean accountability specifically to people of color and organizations that are led by people of color, to make sure that we are doing that deep level of change in all our systems. So I understand that at a legislative level, the process of change happens in these sort of incremental steps, and that you're dealing with a lot of complex political realities. But I also, recognizing what you're saying, Tristan, and what I think many people here share that perspective, what is the long-term goal of shifting away from that system of defending white supremacy?
I think, you know, we're having these conversations and trying to sort of chart a path forward. And I think one of the most important elements of that for legislators is to have a lot of pressure from the wider community, pressuring the individual legislators all over the state for change. That's a really, you know, we can carry things forward internally in the legislature, but we also need a lot of community activity on the outside, and that's how change happens. It's a little more challenging when we're not in the building and there aren't public hearings and things like that, but just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, if I may, there are the long-term strategy, because we're not in a sprint, but we're in a marathon, is our educational system needs to be producing anti-racist citizens that are, and you know, that's going to be a 12-year, 15-year process, so that, you know, a child that enters preschool today with the right and effective education to be an anti-racist will come out the other end to really begin or to continue the dismantling of white supremacy that we start today. So I think we don't want to lose sight of, you know, what happens in our schools, and, you know, kind of the radical reimagining of curricula, so that the output of our schools are anti-racist. The shorter term response is more progressives need to be voted into office. And, you know, you vote your conscience. And in terms of what's happening at all levels of government, from select boards to boards and commissions to whatever elected positions that there are, need to be populated with folks who understand the issues, understand their own personal limitations, seek out other points of view. But, you know, we're in it for the long haul. We're in year 17 and a half of a 40-year initiative. So we're patient, but we're moving in a way that's creating that sort of change that will bode well for us over the next couple of decades.
Thank you. Before I turn it over to Mary, two thoughts. One, I want to explain the complexity of voting your conscience in a very real example that I experienced yesterday, because I don't think people can quite fathom how twisty it is unless you're sitting with it. So yesterday there was a bill on the House floor that it was an economic stimulus bill that I had profound disagreements with, that I had fought so hard to shift before I got to the floor. And even then I was willing to vote against my caucus to vote against it. And somehow magically it had become smushed together with a bill to provide the exact funding for housing that our community needs and has been asking for. And I was also hustling so hard to get into a bill. And so voting my conscience in that situation is like an unfathomable decision. And so the work that happens behind the scenes, I think, all that to say, the work that happens behind the scenes is very hard for communities to see, but I think is the most important work to do. Also curious about, we passed a bill at the beginning of the biennium that I think we were very proud of, about social equity standards in schools. And so I'd be curious, maybe not today, but into the future, if we think that bill actually has any legs or impact towards like really building a future Vermont where kids are actively anti-racist. And you don't have to answer that today. I'm just
Right, 'cause I need to sign off, and hopefully I'll be able to come back.
Okay.
All right.
Bye,
Yeah, I
Chris.
was just going to say, I feel like we should have we should do this again, this topic, in a couple of weeks when we're winding down our June work, so that we can be ready for August in the conversation and have the community engaged in that. So sorry, that was a little process. I know we want to get to Mary. I apologize, Mary.
That's fine. That's fine.
Claire,
So
next.
thank you. Can folks hear me? Folks can hear me? Yeah. Just a couple quick things. I just wanted to appreciate Ethan. I think you're still on. Just, again, bringing back into the conversation some of these broader questions that we need to be asking ourselves in this work around what is the strategy, how do we get at this? And I think those of us who've been doing this for a long time, particularly in this community, know that this is a marathon. And it's also the way that I've been thinking about it more with some of my clients and folks I speak with, is that we are asking people to shift the way they see their world. This is a paradigm shift for folks from the dominant culture. And so it's not really like we're ever going to go back to where we were. It's like, this is the way that we need to be looking at our work and all these different levels. And one of the things that I wanted to share with you all is, and I'm sorry because I need to switch over, I'm not so savvy with technology, but I want to just share with you very quickly the CEC, which is the Community Equity Collaborative. For folks who aren't familiar with this, is a community group which has been around for over a decade, looking at lots of different issues around social justice and equity, and bringing in stakeholders from the community to be part of the conversation. Speaking that what I know is most important, particularly in the work that I do in schools, is that we need people in leadership who are equity literate, who understand what it means when we are talking about, for just specifically schools, school districts, curriculum, teacher education, professional development, courageous leadership through an equity literacy framework. So leadership is critical. And if we're not getting that,
I had a little freezing there.
language and have that set of skills. I'm sorry, can you still hear me? Okay.
I wonder if you want to turn your video off. It's really nice to see your face, and your bandwidth is a little off.
Okay.
I wonder if that would help.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll probably have a better time hearing you now.
Okay, sorry. I'll be quick.
No need to apologize.
But what? So okay, thank you. But around this idea of courageous leadership, but really thinking of being in this moment and looking at who is literacy skills to take us into this work. And I'll be perfectly honest. I mean, I don't have anything to risk saying this to all, but so for example, our current new superintendent who's been offered the position for our school district, I don't know this individual. I have heard from various individuals that there's a question about whether this individual has the skill set, the basic framework and understanding about how to take equity and social justice into the school district. So I'm looking forward to meeting this person and inviting him to our CEC meetings and maybe supporting him in his work. But we need to not be going backwards, right? We need to be moving forward. And so the CEC just came up recently, and this is a draft, but we've been doing a lot of our own work about our own internal process, the way that white supremacy culture shows up. It's been very hard. It's been exhausting. And it's been slow for some of us who wish that we would move faster, which I think is part of white supremacy. But we're making progress, and we have this draft of these, what we're calling the 6 building blocks for disrupting white supremacy culture in the community. And so I just want to quickly rattle them off. And I think as we continue this conversation with you all, and I certainly appreciate a Saturday morning time to do this with you all. It'll be interesting to think about how some of this is connected to the legislative actions. Emily, this interest in this might help. So what we're looking, of course, is at law enforcement. We are looking at public education, and given particularly for us now that we have this new school superintendent, Andrew Skarsniski, I'm not saying the name right. That's certainly a major focus for us. Brattleboro town government and
Mary, can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Sorry, your internet is going in and out,
Yeah,
and which is a big bummer. But we're only,
okay.
we've stopped really being able to hear the things that you were reading. And I'm wondering if we could let Claire, who's in the line, have a chance to join the conversation, and then maybe we can try again.
And I can send this to folks also. I'm happy to send this, the
You can also
CEC's
copy
current
and
draft.
paste it into the chat box, which is a fun option.
Yeah, I need to check on whether I can be that public with it yet.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, me? All right, I'm here as a part of Lost River Racial Justice that Ethan spoke to, but I am also deeply involved with the Brattleboro Area Restorative Justice Center, and I know that's been mentioned a few times. I am not here as a representative. I'm not sure why the Restorative Justice Center was not asked to be here, but I know many of you probably know Mel Motel, the director, who's done a terrific job of reaching out with many other organizations locally and in the state. I wanted to say one thing, that there are very good skills and resources here, but it would need a lot of funding. It could be very greatly expanded and do a lot of the work in terms of defunding, redirecting what police are doing to work with individuals. Basically, I became involved in the Restorative Justice Center when I was in South Africa, and realized its potential, that it's really an indigenous peoples movement. It has a basis of community. You are going part of the community, you're going back to the community. Very un-American principle, which is so individualistic. When I came back from South Africa, I was really pleased to see that Vermont was the only state that had restorative justice as part of its practice. Now many other states have this as part of its practice. So I became a member of the panel, I've been on the board, and I'm on the Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity Committee. And many people who are referred to this, instead of being put in prison or paying a penalty, come to explain the harm that they've done, the impact it had on other people, and how they can make reparations or amends. And there's a very high rate of lack of recidivism, although some individuals do reoffend. So there are really some excellent skills there, but it would be great to see this resource expanded with more funds. That's all. Check. Oh, one other thing, another comment. Many people do not understand the concept of defunding. So the language, I would like to see defunding / redirect, so that people get the idea it's not taking all the funds away from police momentarily, but taking some of the funds and moving it elsewhere to people who have the skills to work with other those populations.
Thank you, Claire. The Justice Reinvestment Bill that we just passed is really designed to do a lot of that redirecting of funds. And a lot of that is around restorative justice programs. And I have a lot of hope for what could happen if we sent more funding to restorative justice programs. I also have concerns about the implicit bias within our restorative justice systems as they sit within our existing criminal justice system. And in that, I think, and I'd love to hear more about this from Mimi if you felt comfortable, but my bias is that the referrals into the restorative justice system have a lot of implicit bias in them on who gets referred and who doesn't, and the discernment involved in that. And then I also have some concerns on what it would take to give adequate training and hold the folks who are on those panels adequately in community, so that the conversations around harm and remedy are as healing and restorative as they should be. And I don't think there's anything personal specific about the people that I know that are working within the restorative justice programs in our community are extraordinary people working very hard and doing very good work, and a lot of them have done the personal work that they need to do, but that doesn't mean that the sort of system that they're sitting within has done that work.
Well, I do think that it'd be great to put more funding into the training. I think that makes a lot of sense, and perhaps funding more positions within restorative justice. I do think you could mandate, take it out of, local, prosecutors deciding what cases get referred. Just say, misdemeanor drugs, go to restorative justice. First offense DUI, I'm just picking, I'm sorry, but first offense DUI, go to restorative justice. Just certain level of crimes, any disorderly conduct, restorative justice. And so, maybe just mandating that would go, and then you would not see the biases that does happen. I think that's definitely true. And it's something to be thinking about.
Yeah, that's what, as I mentioned, I'm on the Diversity, Inclusion, Social Equity Committee of the local chapter here. And there are issues in terms of the state, the variety of ways it's implemented. And there are also issues with the initial training, the initial 2-session training of 2 hours does an inadequate job with addressing implicit bias. And we are trying to do more locally, but it's also very hard to get volunteers when there's nothing really in the states that the training that they need to go through. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It's imperfect, that's for sure.
But it is a wonderful alternative, and it really does address the harm appropriately. I've sat on panels. I think it can be a really great.
Yeah.
I mean, you guys all probably know all about that, but it is a great alternative to what we do, and we certainly lean on it. But I think leaning on it in a fair and transparent way makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Could I add one thing to the discussion about restorative justice?
Mm-hmm.
Emily, you mentioned some concerns about some of the systemic bias that in terms of who gets referred to restorative justice. And I think one of the things that could make a real difference in addressing that from a policy perspective is to decrease the use of prior convictions in determining whether someone gets referred to restorative justice, because that is basically reproducing the embedded bias in the current system. Mm-hmm. And that would be a pretty simple thing to tweak. There's been a lot of writing and research about that nationally in terms of restorative justice and racial bias.
I would like to also introduce into this conversation a topic, I think, for another day, but one that the anecdotal stories that I have heard from several different directions are that in Windham County that we're actually in the prosecutorial approach is less progressive than the state policies have been trying to steer towards, and less progressive than probably our communities understand or expect. And to the extent that, that people have experience with that or something, I would love for us to be able to talk about that, and to talk about whether that's what we want from our local system or not. And I saw Mimi smile, and I do think it is a topic for another day,
Yeah.
but it's heavily connected to racial justice, for sure. So it's not a totally separate topic in that sense, but we try to keep this to an hour, and we're definitely intending to give more space still today, just to make sure that we're complete as a group. But maybe we could circle back to that.
I'd be happy to talk about that at another time,
Well,
that's for sure. Lots to say.
One other thing I wanted to mention is there's a question in my mind is if we are really serving people of color adequately. It's been something I've been raising for the 10 years I've been involved in it. We seem to have a hard time tracking it. But my concern is I'm not sure that people of color are getting referred to substantially. They may be getting the fine in the prison instead of coming to us. So that's something that definitely needs to be checked out.
Yep. And I don't know if people saw, I don't think he was able to join, but there was a letter to the editor last week from Jansen. That was a personal letter, Jansen Wilhoit, about some of his concerns about equity within the judiciary system that are ongoing. And he had hoped, I think, to join us today, but has also got young family, and I think it probably got in his way. But that's just a flag for if everyone saw that. That's another part of another angle into this conversation. And I see Mollie's raised her hand. Sorry, Mollie.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring into the conversation the whole idea that, the economic equity and, we're talking about racial justice, but we need to make sure that we are bringing our communities of color up economically, making sure that we have adequate housing, jobs, supports, etc. And in order to just equalize the opportunities that we have in our community. So just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. I think that was one of my, I think Michael asked about the economic stimulus. Was that you, Michael, way back? I totally agree, Michael. And I think that's some really work that we have the potential to do in the next year. And I'm hoping that we can get it done. Because these issues are so deeply entwined, economic justice, racial justice, gender justice. And I think when we lead with race, it makes all the other conversations possible, but it doesn't mean that the other conversations don't still need to happen.
Well, it's interesting how we're finding this sort of convergence of the Social Equity Caucus and the Workers' Caucus and the Women's Caucus and actually the Climate Caucus, in terms of seeing how there's so many overlapping issues that impact. And it's been the Social Equity Caucus has really been very, very important. Started earlier this year. I don't believe it started. Did Coach start it last year? I think it was just this year.
It was this year, yeah.
And it's just become, sort of such an important forum.
I wonder if anyone else has anything else they want to add on this topic, or if it would be helpful for us to sort of close with 5 minutes of legislative updates, or if we should just say farewell. Those are 3 options available inside my mind.
Emily, oh, excuse me, I should start a video. I am not representing a group. I'm representing, I don't know what I'm representing. I'm a citizen.
You don't have to represent anyone but yourself.
Listening, doing a lot of listening, wonderful listening, extraordinary conversation, thank you. And what comes to my mind is there are a couple of pieces, but one of them is, how do we, at a bigger picture, how do we bring these caucuses to get, how do we find the umbrella? We need an umbrella. Brattleboro has needed an umbrella since I started to feel like I really lived here. And I keep looking for that. There are so many pulls, restorative justice, women's caucus, that equity, and somewhere there is an umbrella. And if we can find the language for that here in the state as well, what is the umbrella? What is it that we all fundamentally believe in? Who do we want? Who do we think we are? Who do we want to be? Instead of having with I'm going to get messed up. Going back to the panels to
The review or advisory.
Thank you. Thank you.
Review versus advisory, like the two different articulations of what they.
My mind was going to juries. Juries are people pulled from throughout a community, and they all have a different perspective. They represent, but they are not expected to all adhere to a single set of rules. They're expected to come as individuals looking at something that's going on. And that's somehow tied to this idea of the umbrella understanding. And I don't want to go into, we don't have time. So
I think it's a really important question. Mollie was referring to the Social Equity Caucus and the Women's Caucus, and those are on the legislature. And hypothetically, the umbrella over those caucuses in the legislature is our parties, the Democrats and the Progressives. But that's very much hypothetical. And the tent, especially for the Democrats, is very, very, very big.
And that separates out the non-progressive. We immediately set up a them and us. And I know that there are fundamental things that we all want.
Mm-hmm. And then I think in Brattleboro, when we started the Windham County Action Network, Curtis and myself and a few other people a few years ago, the idea was to really, post-Trump election, bring all of Brattleboro is so good at starting social justice organizations, and there's so many of them, and leadership becomes so strained because we have so many people who care, doing different things.
It's actually,
and the labor to bring all of those groups together also caused, the 4 of 5 of us that were doing it were all folks that were deeply engaged in other stuff too, and we all totally burnt out and are now doing other things. And so that was part of, I asked a question earlier on about how do we actually sustain leadership in all of this work? And I think that gets to what Mollie was saying about, the economy and how we need to make sure that people are compensated for what they're doing, or they'll,
Yeah. Well, I think it's also important to name that this may be a cultural part of who we are in Vermont and in Windham County and in Brattleboro specifically. Vermont has one of the highest rates of nonprofits, number of nonprofits per capita. Windham County has, I think, the highest concentration in Vermont, and Brattleboro is the hub, the epicenter of our nonprofit startups. And so, we are we're actually an extreme outlier nationally in the fact that we like to create slightly different slices and then populate our efforts there in a nuanced way. And I think it reflects the fact that we care, that we're nuanced.
Absolutely.
And that, caring and being nuanced and having our own version of something is itself a way that we, limit our capacity to be unified in larger sort of macro interventions and also, bridging across the shared values. And so it's It's amazing. It's like that rich tapestry and a kind of a fundamental problem at the same time. Patsy, I'm sorry, I saw you trying to jump in.
No, I go back to a thing. I think this should stop. You all have other stuff you need to do. I mean, unless you want to go on. I mean,
I just wanted to add one thing when you talked about the big umbrella. In the Women's Caucus, we have one Republican woman who joins, and we try very hard to like make sure that she feels comfortable. And she said she tries to bring her other Republican women, and we try to focus on nonpartisan. We work with the Vermont Commission on Women, which is a nonpartisan organization, trying to sort of focus on, well, these are issues that can affect everybody, whatever your political persuasion. And it's a real challenge. And how do you keep this kind of work going and realize that it does affect everybody, but it becomes partisanized?
So we've gotten a request for what the three of us are each doing individually for our own anti-racism work as humans. And then we've gotten a request for legislative updates. So I wonder if we could spend 5 minutes total on our three personal journeys, and then 5 minutes on legislative updates. Does that sound good? Okay. Shall I start with my own journey?
Sure.
Okay. In terms of what I'm doing around sort of anti-racism in my home and caucus, I've been just started, I think, leading some powerful conversations within the Democratic caucus with Tristan about race, power, and privilege, and really doing just like, the very straightforward moving from the personal to the political, having people grapple with what whiteness means to them and how they've benefited from it and how it harms them, and all the sort of like standard curriculum on any Surge chapter member would go through. And so we're doing that as a caucus, and I think it's really powerful, and I'm really grateful to be holding that space for my colleagues. And it really, one very specific example, I think sometimes when you're the person holding that conversation, it becomes hard to also be learning in it. And this last week in one of the conversations, I wound up in a small group with another person who's Jewish, and was able to talk about how being Jewish kept me for a long time from really grappling with my own whiteness, because I didn't think of myself as white. And so it was really powerful to have a peer to be able to grapple with that with, because it's a really hard conversation to have with someone who's not Jewish. So that was a really nice learning opportunity that I found this week with my legislative colleagues. And then I'm raising a white male person. He's a teenager. He's beautiful. And we've been having conversations since he was, born about this stuff. It was certainly easier when we were living in the Old North End in Burlington, because there were sort of more regular object lessons about whiteness and non-whiteness. And but as we've moved forward, it's just part of the air we breathe. We grapple with what's real in the world, and I've never shielded him from what's real in the world. And so that's an important part of my parenting, to be an anti-racist parent. We read Kipling when he was a young child, and we talked about it. We didn't just read it. And then I read almost primarily fiction and poetry at this point in my psychological health life, given how much hard legislative work I'm doing. Really stepped away from nonfiction. And so for the last many years, I've really only read fiction and poetry by women of color. Partly, I'm like, I would say that is more selfish than altruistic, because I spend a lot of time around white men. And that's an important part of my journey and my learning, and like decentering my own experience. And then music and expanding music and having difficult conversations with friends and, the white women I hang out with, and what it means to be a feminist and not a white feminist. And then grappling, the last thing that's been particularly hard the last couple weeks is how to use my voice without centering myself. And so speaking at the Black Lives Matter rally yesterday and trying to figure out like, what can I say that's not centering myself, but still it's really important given the enormous amount of power and privilege that I have as a legislator to be making the statements and to be a leader in my community as a white person. And so that's like the particular journey that I'm on this week around how the space I have is really should be a vehicle to make space for other people.
Mollie, would you like to go?
Well, in the the last couple of weeks, just lots of conversations with my husband and looking at different videos, testimonies, people of color speaking about their experiences, realizing how, of course, I've always thought of myself as anti-racist, and then you realize, well, you are just by virtue of being a white person growing up in an educated situation and privileged. And then sort of hearkening back to remembering the race riots in the 60s and the assassination of Martin Luther King, and sort of flashing back to all those things that are part of my experience is very powerful. And also I think what really helps me is my conversations with our adult children, one of whom is a school principal in East Harlem, and he has he's the only white person on his staff, and how careful he has to be and how conscious he has to be, and his wife who's works in as a consultant but has worked for Teach for America, very much interested in recruiting sort of improving the economic lives of people of color. So, it's a process. It's a process, and that you first start with recognizing your implicit bias and how to go from there, and how to try to do no harm, and how to, as I think Emilie said too, being in a position in the legislature, how to use that position. So I appreciate the question.
Sorry, I just was giving Curtis a update on what the question was that we were responding to, because he was just able to rejoin us. I'm happy to go now, and I think that there's multiple levels at which this work needs to happen, and on the personal level, I would say that I became much more intentional about 2 years ago about understanding myself in the context of racism or racist society in my own location as somebody who's been culturally raised in that racist system, to be racist in a variety of different ways, and to learn, I guess, to commit to being on a humble learning journey, and to try to understand more, and not just intellectually, although there's an intellectual component to it, for sure. Been reading intentionally, been teaching when I had an opportunity. I centered conversations around racist systems in graduate classes that I taught on complex systems, and in my work life, one of the places that I spend a lot of my time is with a company based out of Keene that trains on sharing power and sharing leadership, and understanding that the sharing of power, what that requires from a sort of an emotional intelligence place, and particularly grappling with what it means to be a part of white power systems. I'm a white male in a white power world. And so, I'm really having to do the deep work there to try to make sure that I'm always listening, I'm always absorbing, and that I take constructive and sometimes difficult feedback well and absorb it and reflect on it and move forward with it. And we organizationally have committed to being anti-racist, and also within our household, we've been intentionally engaging. I am raising two sons, as well, and my wife's a pastor, and we have all been sort of sharing in the learning for the last couple of years, and trying to deepen that work. And Emilie talked about how to sort of both be a leader and also not to center ourselves, and that is something that is an edge that I feel like I also am trying to walk well, and appreciate the feedback when I misstep. I'm part of our House leadership team, which means that at the caucus level, I am helping to shape some of the strategies of our caucus. I feel that one of my responsibilities in those conversations, in our leadership conversations, is to surface the things that we're not comfortable sometimes surfacing. And so, and I think that that's another part of white leadership, is actually being clear when I need to break with what is conventional wisdom or what is easy, and to take the risk of offending, take the risk of destabilizing power or of confronting power, and know that it's pretty safe for me to do that, and I need to actually be one to step into that breach and take the hits, that so many have done it without the relative safety that I have. It's one of the reasons last year I was asked to come on to thanks, Curtis. We'll get to you in just a sec. I was asked to come on to VPR on Martin Luther King Day a year or so ago, and I went back and forth with them to make sure that that it was clear that I wasn't taking the place of somebody else that they wanted, and I felt that it was my responsibility to name my own racism and to, of course, acknowledge that Vermont is racist. And in fact, I was really frustrated that they even framed the question in that conversation about, is Vermont racist? Which I thought was an appalling frame, was itself a white privilege frame. And so trying to understand what my responsibility is then as a leader to step out into those conversations and try to take those risks. So with that, I will step back. Curtis, I saw you raise your hand, and
right. I was just curious, not only of the three of you, but much broader. When was the last time you had a conversation with a bigot?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define bigot. One of my favorite things about my district, I think even in the alliance of the 3 districts that we have in Brattleboro, is that I think I have more opportunities to experience sort of rural Vermont culture in West Brattleboro. Mm-hmm. And I am, knocking on doors during my campaign, and I'm like really just still grieving the fact that I'm not going to be able to do that this summer. I didn't just knock on Democrat doors. I knocked on every single door, and had difficult conversations with whoever showed up at the door. And it was one of the more beautiful pieces of my life. I have been doing social work-ish work in the Brattleboro area since I came back here. And I've had a lot of difficult conversations with folks who are both marginalized and had views that differ from my own, and was able to have those difficult conversations while recognizing the power and privilege that I had in them. I think it's and then I also am in the Vermont legislature, Curtis. So I talk to bigots every day.
I was going to say that.
And I have an important spiritual practice for me to survive in that building. That's been a lot harder since we moved virtually, is to find something to love about every single person in that building while discussing the difficult things with each of them. And I was I grieve the loss of that as well, because it's really, really hard to do when someone's inside a little box on a screen. But I think it's a really, really important part of the work to do when we're together, and how we get through those really difficult conversations. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yesterday on the floor, a very big surprise, a conservative Republican got up and announced that it was the anniversary of the Loving decision. It was like, wow, you know, it's sort of like it humanized people, because also we tend to, I think, you know, oh, well, that person's racist, and sort of dismiss them, or that person thinks this way. And I think one of the beautiful things about being in the legislature and being together physically is that you can like see the humanity beyond people, and try not to dismiss them, but try to understand where people are coming from, and then maybe we can move on from there. So.
And I think that it goes back to when we break with white solidarity and we take the risk to confront bigotry, and how we do that. And it's something that in our political work, I do agree that in a variety of different ways it comes up pretty regularly, like weekly. And sometimes in sort of the big public ways, and then there's quiet work behind the scenes, and sometimes it's in tough conversations about how decisions are being made in committee, or around certain votes, or around larger strategic conversations, and needing to confront that bigotry in each of those places. And it's so I appreciate the question, and I think that that's one of the goals that I have set for myself personally, is that to simply be unafraid with giving tough feedback, and also to receive it, and I think that that's a part of the openness, and also to not dehumanize people who are bigots to the point where I've replaced them with a fake image of who they are as humans. I want to confront the bigotry, and I want them also to be stepping into their full humanity, and letting go of their bigotry, and being in a full humanity. And that's a tough balance, not as an excuse for their bigotry, but or loving their bigotry in any way, but actually figuring out, I feel like that's the fundamental challenge of anti-racism, is to have the full expansive view of humanity, but also never to forgive or ignore when we reduce each other.
And so we passed a bill last week, 2 weeks ago, about time is really just gone these days, about granting free fishing and hunting licenses to Abenaki, members of Abenaki tribes. And I was the reporter from Ways and Means on that bill, and it was a fascinating process, because many of our colleagues are sort of adept enough to know to not be explicit in their bigotry, and to help people through their implicit bigotry to make it explicit enough that they know that they must move beyond it without being explicit enough to make people defensive and dig in, is a fascinating process, and one that I think is particularly necessary in, say, the Vermont House versus, say, like Congress, where grandstanding is like par for the course. We don't really do that. And so that's it's an interesting process to do publicly. It's a much easier process to do privately. But that's another example, and even the tough conversation, you missed the something I said earlier, Curtis, but the conversations that we're having within the Democratic caucus are, there's a lot to do even with our, allied colleagues around this too.
It's interesting. That triggered for me a thought. So before we left in February, the General Housing Committee was working on an apology statement around eugenics and the eugenics movement in Vermont, which really didn't end in any formal way until quite a ways into the 20th century, but had sort of absolutely devastating consequences for the Abenaki culture in
Can I
Vermont.
say something before you finish your sentence?
Yes.
I would say it has not ended yet. I think that the way our Department of Children and Families and the implicit bias that is still rooted in them and the communities that are targeted by it is an extension of that eugenics movement. And I think when we say it ended, we do a disservice to what we are.
I slipped formally in there, and that was my intent, was to signal that very same thing. Sorry, but I have no problem with surfacing that explicitly. And also, it was targeted at gay and trans, and there was so a bunch of different stakeholders were impacted by Vermont's eugenics movement, but there was a way in which it was the final step in an erasure of our indigenous culture that was very, very profound. And I was working with the Native American Affairs Council a little bit as a member of our leadership team, and trying to help support the committee to do a little bit more work. And one of the things that I brought back from the Native American Affairs Council to the committee was the fact that they really were resistant to naming eugenics as it affected the Abenaki as genocide, and at the very least as cultural genocide. And it was really surprising, because this is a committee that is by far the most concentrated liberal committee in the entire legislature, by far. And I walked into the room to have an informal conversation with the chair, and within 3 minutes, I had two older white men livid with me for confronting them or questioning them or questioning their intent. And I was like, wow. So I walked right into white fragility here, and I didn't even, I didn't know that was a conversation I was getting into, but I knew that I needed to stay in that, and to not to just give in to that response. And I think that this is the learning journey that we're all on. The more we deepen in our commitment to being anti-racist, the more we have to be in those moments to learn from them, confront them, and to not shy away from that experience. And there's 20, 30, 40 minutes of conversation just about that one particular resolution for another day. But I'm happy to have that conversation with any of you that are interested separately.
Yeah, and then just briefly, for the other white folks on the call, when was your last conversation with a bigot? You don't need to go into great detail, but just when? Was it yesterday, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, maybe never?
I had an interesting one out at Chelsea Royal Diner the day Trump was elected. When I was part of that. When it was an interesting place for me to go, and I sat in a booth by myself. I go there regularly. I support the work they do there, and I sat and wrote page after page of President Donald Trump trying to somehow normalize this. It was very difficult. And there was a conversation going on behind me for people who were celebrating, cheers with their coffees. After that, one of the people who works there, I had that part isn't important. One of other people leaving was saying very proudly, "Good day, huh?" And I said, well, yeah, for some of us, I'm sure it's a good day. It's a hard day for me. And anyway, he and I have developed an ability to talk with each other that's really interesting. And we do. We're human beings talking to each other. And somehow we've gotten past that, which feels great.
Okay. Someone else?
Myself here. I see myself as an anti-racist racist, meaning that I try to take actions in every opportunity I have in all different levels of the system and increase my own self-awareness of my implicit bias, and I can do things that contribute to racism for sure. So it's not one or the other. And I'm also concerned with labeling some people the bigots, some people the good people, and whatever. I think there's a tendency among whites, particularly for those of us who have been involved in the struggle and trying to work on anti-racist things, to label people as these are the good ones and these are the not. And I see things on a continuum of things, people who don't have any awareness of racism and are one extreme, and to people who have been really trying to do the work and still, of course, have bias. But it's like a continuum, people on various parts of the journey. And we can flip back and forth depending on what's triggering us in the movement. It's a constant journey. But I don't see it as the good people and the bad people. I think it's really important for me as I continue to do the work, which I've been doing since 1968. I think it's really important to not label people. And that's it. Okay.
Okay, then I'll reframe my question. When was the last time you had a conversation with someone with bigoted views?
Was that a question, Curtis?
No, I'll reframe my question to having had a conversation with someone with bigoted views.
Your question is, how would you have a conversation with someone that's bigoted?
No,
Yeah,
when was the last time you did have a conversation with somebody with bigoted views? So it's a question, I think, about, opening up a conversation about how we're broadening who we talk to and how we listen, and where also where we do the work.
Right.
And I don't know if it's necessarily even a question that we need to answer right here in this room. It's a really, even if we don't answer it in this room, it's a really powerful question to each be asking ourselves as we walk away from this room too. Thank you, Curtis, for bringing it in. We were just going to trying to respect people's time as many new people join and other people are dropping off. So we had a request to finish off with just our standard legislative update. So
yeah, I wanted to just check in to make sure that, if we pivot back to there and then finish up this call, if there's anybody that felt that they needed to get their voice in who hadn't had a chance to do so because we were talking.
And sorry, before that happens, we've made a commitment to be doing this for folks who have recently joined, to have a part 2 of this conversation in a couple weeks, as we are taking a brief legislative break at the end of June and then are returning in August. And so making a commitment to have a part 2 of this conversation in a couple weeks.
So I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand, so I'm going to take that as permission for us to do just a very quick legislative update in this last 5 minutes or so together, and then we will definitely be out in touch again around when we schedule the next, the next topic follow-up on this conversation. But I do think it will be probably early July, which feels like it should be a really long ways away, but is, I think, only just a couple of weeks away.
Actually, 2 weeks from now is June 27th.
Yeah, so probably 3 weeks, and then I think we're going to take a break after that for not just in the legislature, but with these meetings. We'll probably take about a 6-week break on our Saturday meetings while we're not in session, and then restart when the session gets back running again in August, so that we can keep all of you engaged with the regular updates. There was a question earlier about the economic development package. I don't know if that, it strikes me that that's probably a pretty important thing to hit in our legislative update. And is there anything else that you want me to go ahead? So just very quickly, we passed and the first part of spending COVID relief dollars. 70 million of it was part of an economic development or economic recovery package, and 23 million of it was housing. The 70 million is being pushed out primarily as grants to businesses that had more than 75% drop in revenue over the previous year as a result of COVID. And particularly for the hospitality industry that has had the hardest time functioning without the ability to gather in large gatherings, but sort of ancillary to that is the work that we're doing this week on a second part of a package that has a slightly lower threshold for entry and is also more explicitly available to a wider range of business types. And we're also looking at potentially directing a certain percentage of the second part of the funding that we're working on in ways that actively promote equity, whether it's through women-owned businesses, networks, or people of color business-owned businesses, and also some specific mechanisms to try to make sure that more of it goes intentionally to rural parts of Vermont and where they also have been impacted. That's just very, very high level, and I don't know whether we want to give space for any more than that. I think probably at the end of almost 2 hours, we should just pick this up again next week or later.
So the second half of that bill is something I'm really excited about, which was moving. So we've housed every homeless person in Vermont, essentially. Not everyone, but the vast majority of folks through the COVID crisis, through motel stays. And that's been a really profound and beautiful thing that we've been saying was both possible and impossible for the last 20 years, and was suddenly miraculously possible, and we did it. And so there's been a lot of conversation about what the next stage is and how we can't go back on that progress. And so the bill that we just passed gives money to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board to be distributed to individual community collaborations and community organizations to do like deep building rehab and construction to continue to house homeless folks. And the shape of the bill is exactly what Brattleboro needs. And so I'm very hopeful about that, because the original proposal was much more about sort of rehab of small buildings, which is helpful in other regions and not particularly as helpful here in Brattleboro. And so really hopeful that this will be the next step in making sure that our community organizations have the funding that they need to keep people in homes, because that's like just really the bare minimum I think we can do as government. We also passed first quarter, there's no provisions for ongoing services in the bill. That is a much debated topic that we hope to solve soon, and would be in a different part of the budget than this bill.
And can't be because of the COVID restrictions from the feds.
So that has to be in the regular budget, which we're gonna figure out in August. And we also passed our first quarter budget. I was feeling uncomfortable with the idea that it's essentially a level funded budget with no changes. And then I decided that I'm gonna think of it as the fifth quarter of 2020 instead of the first quarter of fiscal year 21. And I encourage you to think about it like that, because it actually makes sense that way, and it doesn't make sense if you think about it the other way. And so that's what we did, and it was really just like a way of keeping government going while we gather the information that we need to make budget decisions into the future. We didn't have a good enough picture of revenue in order to do that at this time, and so that's why we're going back in August, is to really make the tough decisions about our budget going forward.
And Molly, can I add one thing before you jump in, which is just that I've said this before, I'll say it again. The governor is now yesterday went on to his press conference beating us up for not pushing money out fast enough and not doing it in exactly the way that he wanted us to do it. But what the governor does want us to do is he wants us to spend all of the federal dollars now and then force a $200, $300 million cut to state services in August in the final budget. And so while I agree with Emily that it is important to think of it as a continuation, fifth quarter, if you will, of the last year, we are also poised to have a major battle with the governor over whether we should be substantially cutting state services, which largely are spent, in this case, on protecting the most vulnerable. And so there is a showdown coming around what is the role and responsibility of state government in this moment and going forward, and the saber rattling around how we're using the COVID relief dollars is a proxy for an argument that he's going to make soon, that we have to substantially shrink state government, which means actually cutting services to Vermonters. Sorry, Mollie, go ahead.
You done? In my committee, we've just been considering this miscellaneous motor vehicle bill, which doesn't have anything much exciting in it, except that I just realized there's a provision that a person who's incarcerated and who is ready to be released can get a identification card, an official DMV identification card for free. So they don't have to pay for that. So that just gives somebody some form of identification when they're ready to be released from a correctional facility. But the bigger thing is we had the speaker sort of allocated coronavirus relief funds to each committee to sort of what would be your proposals to spend this money. And we were given $5 million transportation, and a lot of the things that we really wanted to do were not eligible because they either had to be spent by December of this year, or they didn't qualify in terms of the types of projects. They weren't necessarily related to the crisis. But one thing we were able to do is to divert $2 million of that to the finding a nexus with transportation to the buses, the school buses that are needed to continue to deliver meals to students. And in our district, they have been, the school buses, in lieu of picking up the kids and taking them to school, have been delivering meals to every single student in the district, stopping, doing the regular routes. And it was going to be, I think there was a figure of like 200,000 it needed for our district. For the whole state, Hunger Free Vermont estimated that $6.4 million was needed. And Human Services was working on this, and we were able to contribute $2 million to that effort. So I just felt like that was a really great use of the funding, and it looks like, I'm not sure what appropriations wound up doing with the whole package, the $12 million package to continue the whole meal program, including food and transportation, but I believe that that'll go forward. So that was something really that felt like a good, something that pleased me this week in our committee.
Two other things that we did on the floor are we passed universal vote by mail for the general election. And so we gave that authority back to the Secretary of State and took it away from the governor, with whom we had given it to for some inexplicable reason. And so so the Secretary of State's office will go forward with universal vote by mail for the general election in November. And that means that every Vermonter will get mailed a ballot, and folks can then choose to either mail that ballot back in or go vote the regular way at the town clerk's office or wherever they might vote. And so really both a profound move to protect public health, and I think even as exciting, I'm not sure if it's more important or less important, but an incredible expansion I'm hoping, of who votes and who has time to vote and who thinks about voting. And so we have a number of states that have been doing this for years and years, and excited to join those states and hoping that these changes can last beyond COVID. We also passed Justice
I
Reinvestment.
have a question about that. What happens to people who don't have an address, a home, or
So folks, we haven't changed any of the existing election laws. So folks who don't have a home can register to vote based on whatever their mailing address is. And so a lot of people do that with the drop-in center on Main Street. And those folks can either vote by mail via the drop-in center, or they can vote by mail, or they can vote in person at wherever the voting happens this year. I don't know if it's going to be at the town clerk's office or if it's going to be at the Legion or wherever.
Okay.
And there's going to be a big effort by the Secretary of State in the months leading up to in the time leading up to the primary, as well as after that, to send postcards to every voters to ask them to verify their address.
And how many, we had 15 or 20 votes against that bill.
Yeah, we did.
Just
Well, because of the amendments that didn't pass, I think.
Or they used the amendments that didn't pass as an excuse to vote against the bill, but they would have voted against it regardless. I don't know.
So it was an interesting dynamic. There was a question about, I think in response to my statement about the governor's budget cutting mindset, was whether that would be cutting pre-COVID service levels. And I think that that the governor, if the governor had gotten his way with the spending, we would have depleted all of our funds, and then there would have been no choice but to cut pre-COVID service levels. And we've held back some of that money in case the federal government changes the rules and allows us to use it to protect services. And if we can't, we'll push it out to support the recovery. And then we're going to have to address targeted cuts where we are going to be very intentional about trying to reduce the harm. The governor's big budget proposal a few weeks ago was just a blanket cut across all of state government, which of course disproportionately affects certain kinds of services that really impact Vermonters' lives. And so it was a kind of a political punting. Thanks, Curtis. It was politically punting on the hard questions and putting that responsibility back into the legislature. But we will, if we have to cut budgets, we will do so in the way that we minimize the harm as best we can.
And so want to thank everyone for coming. It's now 11 o'clock and it's a beautiful day. So I hope everyone's going to have a chance to go outside a little bit. We are doing this next Saturday as well. Folks are welcome to come and talk about legislation that's happening or has happened. We can continue parts of this conversation about race as well. And we will be probably picking a specific topic to focus on as well. Food access seems like one that's near the top of the list for me that we haven't talked about at one of these meetings yet, but we'll send out more material as we select it. And it's going to have the same login information as every other week, and you can find that. If you don't have it saved somewhere special, it's on Facebook, as well as I'm sending it out on Front Porch Forum. And also Bob Osier always mails it around to some mysterious mailing list that he uses. So maybe you get it through that as well. It's really lovely to see all of you today. Thanks to those of you who joined us at the beginning and those of you who joined us later and stuck with it. Really appreciate the time and community with all of you.
Thank you all.
Very much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.